Hi everybody and welcome to episode 12 of Shetland Trader Chats. So today's episode is a little bit different in that I am going to focus in on a particular topic today, which is Shetland Haps. So you can see one behind me here. I was inspired to kind of focus in on this particular area because not that long ago, I ordered this Hap stretcher, Hap board from a company in Shetland called Paperwork, and it's a collapsible frame. So the long sides actually come in two halves, and then you lock them together. I have never blocked a Hap on a traditional Shetland Hap frame before, so I ordered this, as I said, several months ago, and finally got around to using it for the first time, and I documented that whole process. So I'm going to share that probably towards the end of this episode, just a sped up video of me putting it all together and how one does that on a Hap stretcher. But then I thought, well, it would be nice to maybe make the whole episode a little bit more focused in on these traditional shawls. So I am gonna use these little mini samples here that as I'm talking about Haps, obviously it's easier for me to pick those up and point to them. I use these for teaching, so I teach a Hap class pretty frequently when I travel and teach knitting classes. Teaching a Hap class is always one of my favorite things to do. So where to start? So it's going to be kind of, in some ways, a little deep dive, a shallow dive into Hap construction and the different methods. There's a lot to it for sure. This isn't supposed to be a class or anything like that, but yeah, I'll just share some things. So the first thing to mention is that typically, when I make Haps, I tend to use what's considered the modern method, which is when you start in the center of the Hap and work out the way. There is an older method, which is still primarily what is used in Shetland, where you work from the outside in. So Haps are generally, and also I should mention Hap essentially is a word that means shawl in Shetland. It comes from an old medieval word, I believe, which means to wrap snugly. So not used so much in Scotland these days, but my dad certainly remembers being told to hap up before he would go outside. So that just would mean to like wrap up, before going out into the cold weather. So Haps, you wouldn't call a Hap shawl in Shetland. The word just implies that it's a shawl. And these traditional Haps, there used to be a specific Hap weight of yarn that was spun to make these, and these were worn as a piece of outerwear by women in Shetland, particularly kind of in the 1800s, and then they were also exported from Shetland. Knitting has long been a source of supplemental income, and particularly in that period, things like Haps were knitted for extra income, but they were also worn by women. So they were usually knit as a square, folded in half, and then they'd be worn like across the shoulders. And the top part could be pulled up and worn over the head as well. So again, with it being Shetland wool and the good water resistant properties it has, it certainly was a good thing to wear as a piece of outerwear. So the older method, as I said, is still primarily what is used to create these Haps, but you can also work them from the center out. The very first Hap that I ever made, I did the older method, and I believe that was back in 2008 that I made that. I made that for my best friend in Scotland's first kid, and it really felt like a kind of a rite of passage at that point. It's fairly early into my own knitwear design journey, and I was certainly intrigued by the Shetland lace traditions, and that was kind of what I explored first in terms of looking at my own sort of knitting heritage, if you like, and it felt important that I should knit a hap. I certainly was wrapped in a hap myself as a baby in Shetland, and I'll share, I think I have shared pictures of that before, but I'll put those up again. Me and the rest of my siblings, we all had haps made for us, and certainly babies in Shetland probably get multiple haps gifted to them as newborns. So I decided this would be a special thing to make for my best friend, first baby, and I used Sharon Millers' Bresse hap, I think, to make that. I also had purchased or acquired, I can't remember where I got it, her book, Shetland Hap Shawls Then and Now. So I also was referencing that as I was working that hap. I believe this book is kind of hard to get hold of now. I don't think it's in print anymore. So if you look it up, you might see some copies available in used places, but it might be on the expensive side. But certainly it's full of a lot of history and great images, like the one on the front here. This is showing haps being blocked in hap stretchers, and yeah, lots of really interesting information. Anyway, I set about knitting that shawl. So with the older method, and I'll hold up this one, with the older method, you start at the outside and work in the way. So haps are made up of basically 3 parts. They're made up of a center, the borders, and I'm showing you the wrong side here, although not really a right and wrong side. Anyway, yes, made up of the edging, then the borders, which often get called quarters in Shetland, because there's 4 of them, and then the center. So that is essentially what makes up a traditional hap. Usually the center is a plain garter stitch, and the border section is usually always in old shell, old shale, which is like feather and fan lace pattern. And then the edging is usually a pretty simple edging that's put on there. So with the older method, you would start with the edging first. And in Shetland, some people will knit just one side of the edging, then work one of their borders, and they would repeat that 4 times. And then on the final border section, they would knit a square in the center, and they'd be joining all the pieces together after that. There's different ways that Shetlanders put together the pieces, but essentially you are working in pieces and doing some amount of seaming. So this is all also garter stitch based. So there's no purling. Shetlanders generally don't do a lot of purling because most Shetland lace is done on a garter stitch background. So they tend to be very good at grafting and seaming things together, because that is traditionally how a lot of lace was put together. So in the case of the older method, once you had knit your center square, this one is a diamond of garter stitch. But with the older method, it would be a square. So the garter stitch lines would be sitting horizontally as I'm holding this up. And when you got to the top of your garter stitch square, you would then be grafting together your top border to the top of the square. So some Shetlanders like to knit the whole edging in one go and then pick up either 1/4 at a time, or maybe work 2 quarters at a time. So if you worked 2 borders at a time, then you would just have 2 seams to put together along these mitered corner areas here. Obviously, if you did it in 4 parts, then you would have 4 corners to do. So it just depends on people's preferences, who showed them, all of that. So that is what I did with the first hap that I made, I believe I did each section of edging. So I did one section of edging, then I worked a border and repeated that. So then I had 4 areas to seam together, and then also seaming that center garter stitch square. And you know, I am not great at seaming. I know I'm doing a lot of sewing now and all of that, but with knitting generally I don't love seaming. I like doing things like 3 needle bind offs and all of that, and I don't mind grafting, but seaming not as much. Anyway, after I had made that first hap, and I gifted it, and it certainly was very well received. It's still around. It does need to be fixed every now and then when I visit my friend in Scotland, where the seaming happened. You know, I obviously didn't do a great job, so I have had to fix it before. But the second time I made a hap, and I'm trying to remember if I made that for somebody in particular or if I just made that and kept it myself. I don't remember. But the second time I decided to try this modern method. So that is where you start in the center and work out the way. And instead of starting with a garter stitch square, you actually you make a diamond shape of garter. So that means you start with 1 stitch at the bottom, and then you're going to increase stitches on either side, and that's done by forming a yarn over at the beginning of the row. So you work up to the widest point, and then you're getting rid of a stitch every row, still making up the yarn overs until you get to the top of your diamond. Then you pick up around that center diamond. So the center diamond is worked flat, but then after you've picked up around this, you can then work in the round, which is what I prefer to do. So that is more comfortable to do on like a long circular needle, which is generally what I tend to use for knitting, and circular needles. In Shetland though, and a big reason probably why a lot of people still knit the older method, is that most Shetlanders still knit with a knitting belt, and they knit with very long double pointed needles. So accommodating lots of stitches on the needle when you're knitting a full-sized hap, as you can see there, and you get to that border section and you're then working in the round, that's a lot of stitches to have on the needle. So that works well if you've got a long cable for circular knitting, but if you're working with the straight, even though they're long, straight double pointed needles, that's going to become quite cumbersome. So working in pieces is easier to do on the knitting belts. I have a knitting belt. I don't use it because I never learned on a knitting belt, but I just bring it to classes to show people. And certainly there are a few different Shetlanders that teach knitting belt classes, and you know, talk more about the use of them. I do have needles to go with this, but you know, I'm so used to using the circular needles that that's just my preference. And another reason that Shetlanders wouldn't love the modern method is because of not being as comfortable with purling. They just don't do it as much. With fair isle knitting, they're always knitting in the round, so they aren't doing any purling then. And as I said, a lot of the lace is garter stitch based, so it doesn't involve a lot of purling. But with the modern method, when you pick up around that center diamond, you're then purling every other round as you work the old shell lace pattern, because that's what you have to do if you're doing garter stitch in the round. You have to purl every other round. So that gets worked as one continuous piece, and you're doing your increases at the 4 corners there, and then you cast on extra stitches to work the edging, and that gets joined kind of perpendicular to the live stitches of the border section. So when you start to work the edging, you're just kind of going back and forth in short rows here, and it's almost like it's like an applied edging, if anyone's done that before. And the shawl is just basically coming off your needles as you work that edging. So it's like a very elaborate bind off. So that's, you know, demonstrating the full square hap, which, you know, primarily it was square haps that got made. Certainly at the time when these were being exported, they would always be square haps, but you can also make a half hap. And in that case, with a half hap, you are working flat the whole time, and this is still worked from the center out the way. So you still start with one stitch here at the bottom of the triangle, and you just work to the widest point. So instead of then making a diamond shape, you stop there and you pick up down two sides to work the border section, cast on your edging, and work the same way. It's just that it is worked flat instead. And interestingly enough, even though these weren't very common to see a half version of a hap, one of the earliest pieces that they have in the Shetland Museum is a half hap. I think it's from 1836, and you can go on to the Shetland Museum and Archives website and you can look up photos, and you can put in search terms there. So that will bring up, if you put in haps or christening hap or, you know, that kind of thing, then that might bring up the image of that half hap. And in that case, there's fancier lace or finer lace going on in that half hap. And there's a little peak at the top, so it doesn't go just straight across. The edging goes all the way around and it's slightly peaked, so it probably was a christening shawl that would have gone over the baby's head. And that reminds me just to say that in Shetland, these traditional haps were made and worn by women in Shetland, and they were also exported during the 1800s, but they would also knit these fine lace haps, which essentially are the same construction. It's just that they were knit with 1-ply or 2-ply lace weight yarn, and the center part, well, basically the whole shawl would be a lot more elaborate in the lace stitches being used. And they were nicknamed Ringshaws because they were so fine that they could be pulled through a wedding band. So again, there's some really incredible images of those on the Shetland Museum and Archives. Huge shawls, you know, very tiny gauge that they're working at, again, all on a garter stitch background. So very, very fine, complex looking stitches. So the center wouldn't be plain, it would have, you know, lace going on in there, and the border and the edging would be a lot more elaborate with the lace stitches being used. So I mentioned this book by Sharon Miller to do with haps. She also has another one which maybe is more available called, and it is on my shelf over there. It's called Heirloom Knitting, and that one is a little bit more, it's still got a lot of background and history in it, but it's a little bit more of a stitch dictionary for Shetland lace patterns. So that's a good one to have if you're interested in exploring that more. And then a few years ago, can't remember which year exactly, but Kate Davies wrote this book called The Book of Haps, and I have a pattern in here. So this is also a good resource. She also goes into the history as well. There's some great photos that she's also shared of women wearing haps, working with knitting belts, all of that. So can definitely recommend this book. She wrote it and edited it with Jen Arnold Culliford. I think that's how you pronounce it. So the two of them put this book together, and they invited a bunch of different designers to design haps or shawls inspired by the everyday hap. So I did one in here that's called Lang Air. I bookmarked it so I could show you. So this is Kate in it here. So I kind of took the basic construction of a hap, I made a center diamond and then 2 separate triangles, and they get joined together, and then just used different stripes of color, kind of inspired by an area in Shetland that has a lot of granite, so reddish tones and stuff like that. That's why it's called Langayre, after a specific place. And lots of garter stitch, and something that I did for this shawl, and you kind of have to do it for this shawl in terms of changing those colors, but it's something that I do when I'm making haps, and I've shared it here before on the podcast, is that spit splicing method. So that's just a great way when you're changing, you know, the shades, and you don't want ends to weave in, to use that. So I use that for this particular shawl too. But the very first hap shawl that I wrote a pattern for is actually the one that I am wearing right now, which is called AElight. So this I published in 2009. So this was after knitting that first hap for my friend's baby, and I can't remember, as I said, if I then knit a full hap using the modern method, or maybe I just went ahead and tried out the half hap version, but this was published just a year after I'd made that first hap. So in this case, it's a half hap. I did you start at the point here and you make those yarn overs, and then you pick up down 2 sides. So instead of the old shell lace, I have used a simple mesh lace, which is a Shetland mesh lace, and a simple border. And I was not, you know, other than Sharon Millers' book, I wasn't really aware of any shawl constructions like that used a method like that being published at that point. So I think when I brought that out, people were certainly very much into shawl knitting, which they still are. It remains a popular thing. And but it was I think a different construction for a lot of people. So it certainly was very popular. It still gets knit a lot. This one I actually made in I think it's Malabrigo sock yarn. So yeah, this was the original sample that I made. I made another a few years ago in Shetland wool too. This is in the Jameson and Smith Heritage yarn. So yeah, so AElight just means east light in Shetland. So that was the very first hat pattern that I published, and then later I published a pattern for a full hap using the modern method, and then I added on to that with a half hap option. So this pattern is called Hansel on Ravelry, and it's my instructions basically for this modern method of making a hap, and it comes in 3 sizes. I think this is the middle size. Pretty sure this one on the frame here is the middle size. I have this half hap. It's kind of large to hold up here, but this is the largest size. And the other thing I was going to mention is that you can also make these haps without putting on the edging. So if you take a look at this, you can see there's no edging on this. The old shell lace though does create these kind of gentle curves, which you can pin out to give it, you know, a little bit of an edging type look. But if you don't feel like you want the edging on there or whatever, you don't have to, you just wind off stitches. Gosh, there's a lot more I could say, but I don't want this to end up being a super long episode. But yeah, I have made many shawls at this point, designed many shawls that are hap inspired. After doing AElight, I did a couple more that were using the lace weight yarn and more complex lace patterns. Again, these are traditional Shetland lace patterns. So this shawl is knit in a lace weight. Again, same construction though, plain center triangle, and then lace in the border section and a simple edging. And yeah, so many that I've done. I can't name them all, but I will share a few of them on here on this video. I'll put some images up. Done them where I have kept them in stockinette. I did a few when I worked for Brooklyn Tweed on the design team. Oh no, this was before that actually. This was just part of the other collection that they had, where designers could, you know, submit patterns and they put collections together. So this is called Halagarth. So this is a sort of tree lace pattern, but instead of being on a garter stitch, it is done on stockinette background instead, which does change the proportions. So it makes it a narrower, taller triangle rather than wider within the garter stitch. But yeah, I don't think I will ever tire of using haps as an inspiration. I also did want to mention just briefly about colours. Obviously, when these were first being made, there weren't a whole lot of dyed shades available to knitters, so they tended to be in the natural sheep shades, which in Shetland there are a lot of. So the early ones that you see will use the sheep shades, often in a gradient effect in the border section of the shawl. Oftentimes though, when women were wearing these themselves, they would just knit them in a single colour, and usually in one of the darker shades, so like a murret brown, because they were wearing it outside. It was getting a lot of wear and tear. And also you do see pictures where the edging has been left off, because the edging part isn't going to add a whole lot of extra protection and warmth, and it's going to use up more yarn. So even back then, they would leave the edging off. And then gradually, as dyed colours were introduced, then you start to see more experimentation of shades in there. What I typically do when I'm making a hap, especially if I'm making a hap to give away, but I guess I do this in general, is I tend to, you know, decide what the main colour is going to be first. And when I look back on the haps that I have made, so many of them do have the main shade as one of the natural sheep shades, so either in a light grey like in this one here, or quite often I'll use Eset as a starting point, but you can use whatever you want really. And then I tend to build in the other colours from that. So I'm just really like pulling in colours that I like, or if I'm thinking about it for a particular person, then that's factoring into my choices for colours that I might want to use. Then once you kind of narrowed it down a bit, what you can do is you can wrap your shades in different configurations around some pieces of cardboard. So in my particular pattern, you can see the number of rounds that are used depending on the size that you're making for that border section. So what I like to do is when I'm wrapping the yarn around the cardboard is I will wrap it to mimic the number of rows that colour is going to get, so that I get a good kind of balanced effect of how the colours will look. Typically I'll make, you know, usually about at least 3 different options, and then I tend to sort of put them somewhere with good light and walk past them a bunch to see what is drawing my eye. But there's no hard and fast rules about how you put colours together. If you have, you know, scraps of yarn to use up, you can do it, you know, in a more continuous effect. Doesn't have to be a mirrored image or anything like that. I've seen all sorts of amazing haps made, and if you go on Ravelry and look at projects, you'll get a lot of inspiration. Excuse me, a lot of inspiration there too. And then more recently, I don't think I've shared that on the podcast, or this on the podcast yet, but a year ago, maybe a little bit more than that now, I did this pattern as a knit along, and I called this the Hap Kachchief. So it's not the same construction or anything like that. You start at the outside with this, but you get the chance to play with the old shell lace there, and it is done on garter stitch, and it has got some fun techniques that you use in it as well. So if you're not up for doing a whole hap, then a little project like this. Another one that's been popular, and again, it's not a hap, but it's a quicker project, and it's Shetland lace, simple Shetland lace pattern, is my Tara shawl. And that was in my Shetland Trader book 3, that was all based on designs that my mum had knit. She didn't have a shawl quite like that. It's a bit more of a scarf really. It's like a shallow shape, and it uses the new shell lace pattern, which is kind of the other easy Shetland lace pattern, but forms more of an obvious chevron zigzag in it. And anyway, that is a fairly quick knit too, and a fun way to just, you know, dip your toes into a little bit of easy Shetland lace if you're interested. I'm sure there was like loads more I was gonna talk about, but I'm already on the half-hour mark, and my video showing the whole blocking process of this is probably about another 5-ish minutes. So I think that I'm gonna wrap it up there. So yeah, this time I'm not really delving into a whole bunch of other things. I'll leave that for the next episode. I've been doing lots of sewing, and of course have other things to share, but I think we'll leave it there for today. So hope you found that interesting, and please leave any questions you have in the comments. I will do my best to answer those, and you can let me know if there's a particular thing you'd like me to talk more in depth about in other future episodes. And until then, I hope you all are having a lovely summer if that's the season you're in. It's going to be getting hot later here today. I'm recording this fairly early in the morning, so that it's nice and cool. And that's it. See you next time.